We're going to take the page that we've been working on and I'm going to show you how you can create your own custom grids. As you can see, the page that we're working on stays the same. These two articles remain in a two-column formation, even when it gets far too small for them to remain as such. So we're going to create some custom variables that will allow us to augment the mixins that are used within Neat. I'm going to go into the file that we've been working on, and here up at the top I'm going to make a couple of variables. I'll start off by making a variable called my desktop grid, and we're going to pass on some parameters here. So the columns for this are going to be 12, just like the default grid. We're going to set a gutter of 20 pixels, and we'll set the media to be 1,000 pixels. I'm just going to copy this and we'll create a couple more of these, one for tablet and one for mobile. The tablet is going to contain 4 columns. I'll reduce the gutters down to 15 and we will change the media to 650. The mobile is going to have a media of 200 pixels, gutters of 10, and columns are going to be 2. We're still going to need the grid wrapper to have the grid container, and we'll leave the visual grid on. In column wrap A, I'm going to simply comment out these 2 lines of code and we'll incorporate our own custom grids here. I'm going to use @include and I'll use grid media. This is going to tell my SASS file which of these variables I should pass on. So for this one we're going to use my mobile grid. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use an indented @include mixin and we're going to specify the number of grid columns. So I'm going to write grid column and we're going to set the grid columns to 2. And just so you can see what's happening here, I'm going to use my visual grid here as well. We'll set the color to violet and we're going to have it display the results of my mobile grid. If we save now and we come back into our file and refresh, you can see that here are the results of what we have. Now what we've specified is that we want this grid to appear and it's going to override or trump any of the other grids. So you can see we have the purple 2-column grid showing, and this is going to display no matter what size my page currently is. You can also see that now these take up 1 column instead of 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some more code so that we can add the breakpoints for our page. The next mixin is going to be our tablet sized mixin. So this one's going to kick in after 650 pixels. We're going to also have this include a grid column of 2 columns. That means it's going to take up 2 columns worth of space that's going to be available. And let's change the color of this to sky blue, just so we can see the change occurring. And I'm going to have this tied to the my tablet grid. If we save now and I refresh on the page, you can now see that we have the blue columns. It's showing us the 4-column setting that we set up in our tablet grid. These 2 articles are now dividing equally within that space, so they're taking up the 2 columns. And when I get below 650 pixels, it changes to our 1-column grid. So now you can see we have 1 column for the small size screen, and then we're going to have 2 columns for the large size screen. That's really all we need for this upper section. We're going to be moving down to the lower section. I actually have 3 of these articles, and we're going to make a separate grid system that is going to work on these. We'll still use our 3 variables that we created earlier, but now I'm just going to use a new selector. So this one is going to be for column wrap B, and I'll just copy these because what we're going to have here is going to be similar. I'm going to use my @include mixin and I'll use my mobile grid. I'm going to tell the grid to just have 1 column here. I can change this a little bit, and we'll keep the color at violet. For the tablet grid that we're creating, I'm going to have it take up 2 columns, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add a 3rd criteria here for the desktop version. So I'm going to change the grid media to my desktop grid. The desktop grid is going to kick in after 1,000 pixels. We're going to have the grid columns B4, and this will have a color of orange and we'll tie it to the desktop grid. If we save now and we refresh on the page, you can see that we get 3 columns here at the bottom. Now I am in a large size screen. As I reduce my page down, you can see that these now go to a 2-up version, and since there's only 3 of them, the third one is going to be on a separate line. And then as I reduce my page down farther, these are going to stay in a 2-up rather than going to a 1-up, and that's because we had augmented the number in the mobile grid column. So we had specified this to be 1. If I want these to span both of the columns, remember that my mobile grid has 2 columns. Right now I'm telling these articles to take up 1 of the 2 columns. If I want them to be full screen, I would then change this to 2 as well. So I'll save that, and if we refresh, you can now see how these stay in the 1 column format as well. And as my page gets bigger, once I hit my breakpoint at 650, then they'll go to the 2 column layout like we had above. And then finally, once it gets above 1,000 pixels, it's going to switch to the 3 column layout. And so these numbers here, where it says include grid column 4, remember that the desktop has 12 columns. So this is going to take up 4 of those 12 columns. And in turn, that's going to give us 3 columns. So when this one, for the tablet size grid, the tablet size grid has 4 columns. When we say that we want it to take up 2 columns, that's going to give us 2 columns. It's going to take up 2 of the 4 available columns. And here, for our small screen, when it says that we want to use 2, because it is only 2 columns, that's going to give us our 1 column. So you can see that it's very flexible and pretty easy to be able to incorporate these media queries into your projects. I do want to show you the code that's being generated. If we look at, for instance, the column wrap A, so that's these 2 top columns that we have right here, you can see that there's a media that has a min width of 650 pixels, and then it's specifying the width is being calculated, it's floated on the left, it has this margin setting that's being applied. And these, of course, are all results of the parameters that we are passing into our mixin right here. And it's then going to generate these things on our page. So Neat is pretty cool. You can definitely get a lot of flexibility when you're using this in your projects, and it makes it really easy to make flexible grids. Let me just show you one other thing that we can do with our grids. I'm going to go into my HTML and I'm going to copy the section tag at the bottom, and I'll paste that in, and let's actually just reduce this down to just have 1 article. So this last section is just going to have 1 article, and I'm going to give this article a class of column wrap C. If I save this and we look in the browser and refresh, you're going to see that now I have 1 new article that's appearing at the bottom of my file. I'm going to go back into brackets. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to make a rule for call wrap C, and we're going to use our @include mixin, and we're going to say that we want the grid columns to take up 6 spaces. Now right now I'm going to be using, my grid wrapper is using the default grid container. The default grid container actually has 12 columns. It has a gutter of 20 pixels. So these settings that I have here are reminiscent of the default grid container. So what we're saying is that this particular article is now going to take up half of the available space that's available. So if we save this, and if we look, you can see that this takes up 6 of the columns of the original grid. So it's taking up half. Now there's a little bit of indentation here, and that's because by default, the grid container is going to have a little bit of padding located on it. And you can adjust that if you need to, but we're not going to worry about it right now. The final thing that I want to show you here is going to be a push mixin that we can use to push the content over. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say grid push, and I'm going to push it over by 2 of the columns that are available. So if we refresh now, you can see that now this has been indented 2 columns from the left. It's pushing this over 2 columns from the left. So if I wanted it to be pushed over 6 columns, so it shows on the right hand side, all I have to do is adjust that push value and change it to the number of columns that I want to push the content over. So now you can see that it's going to appear on the right. Again, this is an easy way that you can control where your items are located. You can use grid push. And this is also available in the documentation. If you want to read more about it, you can read up on it here. I hope you found this introduction to Neat helpful and that you'll be able to start using Neat in your projects so that you can take advantage of this really lightweight grid-based library that works well with SASS.